The Australian Curriculum Studies Association would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and the waterways from where we are all meeting today. We pay our respects to the elders past and present, and we extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. We value the contributions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to education and their continued support of the teaching and learning of all Australians. We recognise that for thousands of years, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been the first teachers, and that we are committed to continue our learning alongside them. Welcome everyone, and we are delighted to start our conference series with Dr. Joanne Casey from the University of the Sunshine Coast. As you know, our conference this year is being held in an online virtual space, so you have the luxury of being able to stop, rewind, go back and share with your colleagues. So we are delighted to welcome today Dr. Joanne Casey. Hello.
Thank you, Anna. It's lovely to be here. And whilst I'd love to have been there in person, this is good too. And what I love about this format is we get to have a conversation and interact with the key pieces that I'd love to share with you today. So I thought that what I might do is just cover, the three big ideas or the three pieces that where we're headed today, which was the first of all, what does it mean for curriculum leadership in relation to renewal with a social brain lens? And then looking at the fact that curriculum collaboration is really important work, but I think what we can do is underestimate the social and cognitive complexity of that work. So I'm going to sort of share, what does that mean? And then more importantly, what do we do about it? So what, if we know this stuff.
We love takeaways. What are we going to
do? What can we do? So, so let's get started. Did you have a question to start with?
No, well, I think it's probably just the fact that you talked in that space of curriculum and social, and those sort of two things I think are kind of being pulled apart in a lot of environments, because we do social and well-being in that box, and curriculum is the stuff that's written on a piece of paper and mandated, so it's different. And so for you to be bringing them two together kind of goes, I'm like opening the doors to these boxes. What's going to happen? So it's so impressive.
Well, I think too, you need to understand from my perspective, I've come from a space where I see these things siloed. And I look at the notion of silos. So I'm fascinated by silos and siloed mentality. And when I look at schooling in particular and the way we organise schools, there can be this disconnect between the pieces and the components. And it's understandable because of the time that we have available and what we're trying to undertake in that time. It's also related to the history of schooling and how that has emerged or come about and what we even define as in schooling. So I'm referring to that industrial model. And, it's a balancing act. And when I was in schools and not so long ago, I was wearing three hats. I started here at the university full-time only last year. So I actually was here since 2006 part-time. But the other piece that I was doing was I was actually doing leadership roles or teaching in schools part-time. And then I was doing some consulting work as well. So I had these three pieces where I was working and doing the work on the ground in the schools. So from a curriculum leadership perspective and looking at pedagogical frameworks, instructional frameworks and doing that work, and then presenting that more broadly across Australia. And then also looking at it from the perspective of teacher education. And what it allowed me to see was, this evidence base, what was going on. And I was seeing these really good fundamental evidence-based processes and approaches that seemed to be falling over. So fundamentally, collaboration was being viewed as something that was really valuable so that we could have this collective knowledge around curriculum design and understanding curriculum. Yeah. So one of the things, I was head of department and we were doing curriculum implementation. And what I noticed was, because of the size of the school, as we were, and it was P to 12, so, and I traversed both the secondary and as well as the primary. And what I was seeing was, when we were having these conversations with individual teachers, their interpretations of the curriculum or the assessment varied. And what we also then started to put in place were, well, let's have these collective conversations. And it was really the work of the DeFores and those professional learning communities and building that collective understanding. But at the same time, different curriculum bodies and systems, education systems, were providing support mechanisms like resources to say, look, you won't have to worry about the content. You'll just have to worry about pedagogy. Now, as someone who has taught every year level up to year 10 and in different contexts, so in the 3 different education systems, that probably gives you a hint how old I am. But anyway, we won't go there. But what I found was, if you didn't understand or have a deep understanding of the curriculum content, then the pedagogical decisions that you were making could be problematic. Or things like, this is what some of my teachers would say to me when we were designing, and collaborating on the design of curriculum unit plans and things like that. They'd say things like, they'd design the assessment, and then when it came to moderating, we'd say, how did that go? And we'd have all these processes, and they'd say things like, yeah, we didn't do it. And I'd go, oh, okay. What happened? Oh, our kids can't do that. And so what we found then was this disconnect between what they thought the assessment looked like, sounded like, and felt like, but also their expectations of their kids. So part of what I thought was my role was that I needed to actually see if that were true, as in, did I have a different perspective? What was it? And what was really lovely was that these people would invite me in and say, yeah, come on in and let's have a go. Let's see what we can do and see if that... And we unpacked. I'd do the demonstration, or we'd do the assessment, or we'd do whatever it was that we needed to do. But it was the conversations afterwards that really held the rigour of, well, why did you do that? And I thought it meant this. And so I could see that we were pulling, curriculum knowledge apart and understanding what these terms that we throw about in education, and we assume that everyone has the same understanding. Now, again, full disclosure, I come from a perspective of a socio-cultural view of the world, which is that all of these texts are constructed, and therefore we will have multiple perspectives and readings of those texts, which then invites us to have these conversations with our colleagues to say, well, is that what we mean by this? And pulling these apart. And does it mean that when we say it's at this achievement standard, or at this part of are we talking about these things? And can we commit to, what can we commit to? So fast forward, and all of a sudden I saw all of these pieces, and people were really wanting to get into these really great conversations. Yes. But it took time, effort, luxury, and energy. Yes. But initially, people were doing that kind of work after school. And then there came a time where they were doing it within school, and it costs money to do that. But we also then saw the advent of these technology or these tools that were adding layers to what we were doing. So let's move forward again and have a look at. So what I couldn't work out was, here is, we're being asked to collaborate. It's not, and it's really, worthwhile work because we're really developing this deep knowledge about not just the content, but our students and how we might adjust and change and all those things. So it was the pragmatics of the work, but it was being done through those conversations. And I kept thinking, why are these things falling over in schools? Why does it seem to be? And I had this aha moment when I came across the work of Robin Dunbar.
Yes,
and it was actually
this. Yes,
piqued
my interest.
Yeah, well, the thing was, it was part of, I said silo mentality. I love that stuff. So I'd been reading this book around the silo effect in organisations, and I came across Dunbar's work, and all of a sudden I did this aha and went, what we do in school. So, for example, he proposes that we actually can maintain 150 relationships at any one time. And that's not 150 at work and then 150 at, a home. It's 150. Now, they're not always all equal in strength. And yes, there are some adjustments and things. And he's done it in the online environment and things like that. So I decided one Friday evening after a beverage, I was going to reach out to Professor Dunbar and ask him, so has this been done in schools? Because what I started to realise was the way in which we quantify the relationships in schools. So relationships are fundamental to what we do in schools. But the way we quantify them actually misses what he's talking about. So, for example, in a primary school, if I'm teaching year 4, I might have 25 students, but I've also got their carers and their, the number of carers. But I also have, even if it's just one team member with another year 4, so 2 streams of year 4s, that's, because we've heard the notion of we need to be collectively looking after the entire. So that means double that. And of course, we're going to be giving most of our focus to our 25, but we're also looking at the entire cohort. Plus, we've got the relationship with my colleague, as well as and these relationships are different. So we call them differentiated because of the first of all, Dunbar talks about the frequency of contact, our reciprocity, so our trust, and how we see that relationship as being important to what we are doing. And we know that relationships decay very quickly. So if we don't invest in them in ways that are very simple, just face-to-face, having a cup of tea, there's a whole range of things, which I won't go into. But what we start to see is that in a primary school, you can very quickly reach 50 more or more relationships. Secondary school, 150 like that. But what we then don't go into are the components of the different pieces. So one of the slides I've actually done for those who watch is I've actually unpacked. So if I go into our curriculum, so as a primary teacher, I might be teaching, say, 5, 6 subjects, maybe. And with each of those subjects, again, we overarching have a, and it's normal and a category. So English. And then we'll say, there's 3 strands. And then we go into the 3 strands. Now, what I haven't done is the year level description or the rationale, and looked at that and sort of get a really deep understanding of that. We usually just dive straight into content descriptors.
Definitely.
Which in of themselves are actually related to the achievement standard, which in turn, year level description, which in turn is the rationale. And so there is this line of sight, and we need that whole understanding rather than just the one piece. So what ends up happening is in the pace, we go to the finite or the piece that we think is most important without always seeing all of these other connected layers.
And we see that in schools with time poor, we understand in that whole complexity. And so you end up getting to a point of, we'll look at the achievement standard and work our way back, which we know is a product of the industrial system of education. We go, what do we need to get the kids to? Okay, I'll work back and fill in the gaps as we go along.
Yeah.
Instead of coming from a lens of, I understand what I need to get there. I haven't got time. I've just got to get there. Let's work our way backwards. Yeah.
Yes.
And I think what else you really taught, which I really liked, was when in my head, I'm thinking about, I've got my class of 24, then I've got my colleagues. But in addition to that, who I say every day, I've also got the OT who's working with that child. I've got the physiotherapist. I've got the speech therapist. So I'm learning a whole new set of skills in that conversation. So every relationship brings with it a sense of complexity, in the sense that no one size fits all. So you're asking me to do this with one kid, this with one child, and then, but I in your head, I've got 24 children, they need the same information, forgetting all of those nuances that, you're sort of describing in that process.
Absolutely. And configuring the learning space. So how do we configure, and what's the culture and the climate of the classroom that we're trying to provide or at least promote.
Yes.
So what you end up having is this snowball effect of the number of the interactions or the collaborations that are occurring, layered on with the different types of relationships. So the way in which I have to cognitively switch the way I'm thinking and how I will interact. So it's this constant switch, plus then I've got the layers. So if you think about it as the twirling of plates, but also, and the number of twirling plates, so you're doing this, but at the same time, the plates are actually layered. So you've got layered plates and you're doing this. Now, what we underestimate then is what's the social complexity in being able to interact in those different ways and at different times and switching. And so the fact is there is this higher order of intentionality in the way that we undertake these interactions, because we also are trying to work out what someone else is thinking. So when I say something, we sort of assume that they've got it, and it's not until the wheels fall off that we go, I don't think I think they've got a different understanding of the assessment or even formative assessment. So, I have been in spaces where I've heard people talk about and say, in this school, we use guided reading, for an example. And I go, oh, fantastic. And then as I move through, because I've been invited in at different times to provide feedback or support in different things, what I notice is that we're operating from very different mindsets when we think about what guided reading is. And I'm not saying there's one definition. What I'm saying is that when have we had the conversation from a curriculum perspective, as well as the pedagogical of what does this mean? So no wonder we're tired, and if we...
Yeah. And when you're thinking of that cognitive learning, that you mentioned before, when someone says, oh, it didn't work for my children or whatever, I think, I feel very luxurious in this position now where I can engage in reading and having that ability to have conversations with people like yourself. And it's a luxury because when you're in the classroom, you do your job and then you've got a 15-minute break to have your cup of coffee. And mentally you go, I'm not talking about work. I'm going to have my cup of coffee in peace and I'm just going to reset and I'm going to go back into it. And so the actual real crux of what you're talking about, which is so important, you push aside because you're like, actually, I don't have that mental brain power and I don't want to I just want to do what I deem my job without seeing the long-term benefits of that kind of as you're saying, standing around the coffee machine, having those conversations. And I think we see that in other professions. People will go for a coffee and you see them in the workplace and they're having a coffee talking about a project or a kind of a new thing that they're building, and they talk about it. Whereas we seem to kind of really just shut down, and it's like, this is my protected time. Don't talk about work. And I don't want to do any more work after school because I've still got my marking to do and I've still got this to do. So we've kind of created that really negative space through exhaustion and cognitive load.
And looking at the structures that we put in place to support the conversations, the professional conversations. Yes. When I think about how we go about it, what I hear is, it costs too much because I have to release this one and I have to do that.
Yeah.
So the cost is seen as a financial one. And what I've actually been exploring and have evidence to support is we actually have a cost to the individual as well as the organisation that we are not recognising, and yet we're seeing it's like we're not joining dots, for example, because we're seeing people who are, the mental health around and the energy. But we also hear criticisms in the media that teachers aren't doing enough, the schools are not doing enough, and so there's this blame game happening. And how do we protect our school leaders and support our school leaders in doing this work and saying this is an investment that we can have short-term wins, but also it's a long-term game, and the notion of how do we support them? So on that space, let's get there. So the first thing is to recognise that this issue and the additional consequences are actually happening, and therefore that our leaders actually need to be supported with additional but different types of knowledge, training and education in the space.
Yes.
And then that means things like, for example, understanding that collaboration as an organisational strategy is really important. It's really important, but it can be derailed if we don't understand the social and cognitive complexity.
Yes.
The fact that the culture is related to that. So if I don't trust my colleagues, because fundamentally relationships are based in that trust. So how do we do that? The fact of the cognitive limitations, which is the stuff that Dunbar talks about. So each of these pieces actually support one another. So first of all, what do our leaders know, and how might that be applied in practice, which comes back to...
And that's really interesting because I'm thinking with the leadership head on as well. It's very easy. You get given some funding and that person is going to lead that curriculum area. So they're going to release the time. But sometimes when you elevate someone into that role within a set community and not understand the complexities between colleagues and say they're younger or less experienced than other ones, you can create that kind of negativity of, well, I'm not listening to them because what do they know? They've been on a course and they don't know. And you really have to, I always think, get external people in because that's great because then they have the new relationship and they trust them. But similarly, how do I build the capacity of someone in my school to go, you will be a curriculum leader in this space? Yeah. So it's a real juggling act.
It is.
A leadership position.
And I would say a gradual release of responsibility.
Yeah.
I would say that over time, and it's about building that trust and having that outside who is also an insider, as in they understand education. Because that can be, we have lots of experts that come in that actually are not they're not educators as such, or they're not in educational research. No. And they're telling us what we should be doing so it comes from a deficit perspective, but also from a small space of, well, this is what went wrong. And this is not, what I'm proposing is not from a deficit. This is actually about the collective wisdom. How do we actually access that collective wisdom and continue to build on it without it becoming a silo of an echo chamber. So it's having those things. So the thing is looking at the time that we allocate, but also listing. So sometimes we don't actually, as leaders, list the different initiatives. And we allocate those to our different leaders and say, this is going to be your portfolio and this is going to be your portfolio. But we don't necessarily see how those pieces are actually adding cognitive complexity to those on the ground.
And we see that so frequently in schools. We use the term transparency very flippantly in many aspects. Oh, we're transparent, we're doing this, and this is our handbook, here's the handbook, refer to the handbook, whatever it would be. And then we put these beautiful pedagogies in place where we are very explicit in elements of the child knows the expectation, the child knows the learning objective, and that's fine. And then as a staff, as a collective, we sort of assume that they're all on that bandwagon with us and go, oh, actually, I didn't explain to you that this was going to lead to this, or this is what I was hoping to get. And obviously that's the complexity I'm thinking in your work, is that the metrics of kind of really assessing that is probably quite a difficult area to kind of go, well, how do I know the success is happening in that part of it? Yeah.
Well, that's where social network analysis helps.
Right.
So and also understanding that we need both quantitative and qualitative data. So one of the things that you'll notice about my work is that I understand numerical data has power, but for me, with equal power is the voices of and the lived experiences. So building those and together. So what basically the last piece here is that when we think of leading curriculum renewal, there are three pieces. We need data. We need data.
Yes.
But the data sometimes that we use negates observations and conversations. Yeah. And I'm saying that we need observations, conversations, and the artifacts, and we have those conversations together because it shapes the amount of instructional time. It shapes the amount of time that we afford to specific content and knowledge. And so even those conversations, like someone will say, well, I think this is more important, so they hone in on that. So those conversations together, and I'm not saying that that's not the case, but we need to make that more explicit so that we go, that's why they're doing, okay, got it. Or this is why, some of these pieces may not be... we may not be getting the data that we had expected or the outcomes that we expected. So I also talk about when we triangulate, we look at this notion of what's the intent of the curriculum, what's our context for our curriculum, so the our curriculum maps and things like that, and our student data, and how have we actually moved between these. That, again, takes conversations because there's lots of assumptions that underpin those.
100%. I'm just thinking in my head, I mean, I always find that, even within a year group, you might have a 5-stream year group. Every single class contextually is very, very different. So we sometimes run at risk sometimes when we do things and roll something out as assuming that every teacher will just do it the same way. And we really do a disservice to the skill set and the training that a teacher and the confidence we have in that teacher. And I remember challenging this when, given a science program what it was, and I was up in the, the Northwest, and those children would never have seen a panda or a polar bear. And so here I am trying to say, well, what's the baby of this? And going, this wasn't contextual for my children. So I have to, and the real key part is what you're talking about is if we have those curriculum conversations and we challenge some things, and it's not about going against what's mandated, it's about saying, well, this is the message of what the curriculum would like us to showcase. We want to see baby animals and adult animals. What is right, and how do we have that conversation to go, it's okay, we don't have to show that, we can. But that only happens when you've got the confidence of one another, isn't it, and building that.
Absolutely. And that difference between early career teachers as well as very experienced teachers. So the other thing that, what research has usually shown is that we tend to teach more than what we should at the risk of depth and complexity.
Yes.
So being able to look and say to people in those conversations, what is reasonable in the time that we have available? Yeah. And that is fascinating when we start to have those conversations with the teaching team in the secondary context, for example, the English department or the mathematics department.
You can't read every book.
And yet, if I go back to the curriculum and I read that it says something to students will engage in a range of texts, and I'm just picking English. I find that fascinating when I go and have a look at what is actually being delivered and we've chosen one. And it's like, well, how do we manage to do that? So it's those conversations where we have basically shortcut some of our issues.
And that's been one of the lovely things I've found in my role, having conversations with people of what they view curriculum to be. And I had one lovely conversation with Summer House, and she talked about the cheese platter, and that you need to understand cheese, but you don't need to eat the brie, the Gouda, the Parmesan. You don't need to eat all of them to understand the context of cheese. So you don't need to cover it all. You take what you enjoy, you have a lovely time, you've enjoyed the meal, then you move on to whatever it is. Yeah. And then similarly, Dr. Emily Ross was on our board. She talked about the map. You can go from Sydney to Perth, and you can take the straight road, or you can go and visit little parts of Alice Springs, or then you could go down to South Australia and enjoy.
Absolutely.
And you don't need to take the shortest route, but you're eventually going to get to Perth, or you're eventually going to get to Sydney, but how you get there. And I think that's probably something as a young graduate, as you're talking about, is finding your rhythm in pedagogy and curriculum is something that takes time. And we try to push so much, and you kind of think, I've graduated, I've done it, I'm now a teacher. And that's actually only the start.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons that I will always come back to what are the big ideas. So when I think about, Wiggins and McTighe and those enduring understandings, we know that our curriculum is over packed, and when we start unpacking like an accordion that unfolds, there is just so many pieces. But if I can come back to, and we've done this collectively, what are the big ideas? Then I can keep using that line of sight of, well, does this unit, or across our year levels and across, from P to 12 or P to 6, or, have we actually got the range, and having those conversations. So what I ask people to do is visually create those. At the same time, I encourage visual maps so that they can leave tracks of their thinking, and that becomes, so any of that notion of how we interact, it allows us then to basically, as a memory cue, because if I can't keep it all in my head, or I'm trying to balance, here is a way that supports that ability to have those conversations, come back to them if we need. And we also have the ceremonial taking the post-it notes or crossing things out. So it can be very cathartic having that piece too.
Someone taught me about that. I think it was using Microsoft with the to-do list. And when you hear the click, it's like a little dopamine hit of gone. Whereas I find it much exactly like the post-it notes. And I have this picture of me where during the day, and then I'll clip and throw them on the floor. And at the end of the day, I can actually visualize this is what I've achieved. Yeah. Isn't it? And that's a very simplistic way, but it makes you go right, scrunch, throw, done. Yeah. So
and if you think about
kind of idea, though.
Well, and if you think about, again, if we're feeling overloaded, and when we look, and each of our teachers and our leaders are different, if I acknowledge that, I'm also looking for ways that will support them to be energized in the work that they do, because we know that this takes a lot of energy and effort, and sometimes, unfortunately, messages more broadly are not conducive to building our energy. They can sometimes sap our energy.
Yeah, and I think that's, I've talked a lot, because I found that having working with a colleague or a mentor was quite confronting at the beginning, because I thought they were judging me on my teaching.
Yes. Yes.
And then working with someone I really trusted, and then having the debrief, starting with, your sandwich of positivity, this went really well, this went well. I think we could improve on this to do this. And I was like, oh, perfect. And I needed to hear it from someone I thought, oh, they've actually watched the things that I wasn't able to in that lesson. I couldn't see that child was really either struggling, or that one was flying and I wasn't being able to take the direction. And that's such a thing that, we talk about these social relationships, how rich it is, but we don't, at the end of the day, we go, oh, I've done that lesson and move on. As opposed to going, what success was in that lesson? What did that come about? And it's not a grade on a piece of paper. It might just be, as you talk about, the aha moment. That worked for that one. That worked. I'll utilize that to bring on the next one. But that is such a luxury, isn't it? And having to really drive that home, that's essential, I suppose, is where the crux of your work comes in, making sure people know that.
And also understanding how at when we look at investing in our schools, and as a leader, school leader, having to look at the finances and what is available to us, and basically thinking about, if we think that our people and relationships are important for the work that we do, how are we investing in this financially? And what might that look like? So again, contextually, there is no one. So I'm not saying this is the answer. What I'm saying is that you take these principles and you start to think about, how might this look in our context?
Because I've been watching, especially overseas, a lot of schools which are now have got these add-on research centres where a lot of the research is done. And I, being in this role and seeing that scholarship versus in practice, the theory in practice, I just remember thinking, imagine if you had a day where you worked 4 days, and then as a team on a Friday, it was like a department, you are bringing together all that research and you can contribute to a paper or whatever it was. And so you have a real focus as a collective of going, we've got something gold here. Why don't we put all of our energy into using what we're doing to create something? And I thought that would be such a lovely thing, of way of keeping people engaged in scholarship. And also using practice to inform. And I think we've mentioned just before we started this that we seem to put them into extremes, as opposed to going, one has to feed the other to keep going.
And what's doable, so I am still in contact with a number of my colleagues who here on the Sunshine Coast. And I'm constantly checking in to say, so what are the problems of practice, or and I mean for you as a leader in doing this work, as well as my colleagues who are in the classroom, and then thinking about, well, what might a partnership look like? And it comes to trust. It's thinking about that reciprocity. And, when we talk about evidence-based, again, I get concerned that we jump to what is the loudest and what may be convenient because of the time constraints that we have. So one of the things that I encourage my colleagues and friends is to, who do we trust? And when we think about that, how might we use, for example, things like AI to support us in getting some of that information, or podcasts in being able to listen to some of these people who are experts in the field, and what makes them an expert. That's the other piece is, so I would encourage that anyone who is in schools, that we always remain with an open curiosity.
Yes.
As well as a healthy skepticism, so that we can basically ask questions and reach out to those that we think, I think this is a person I could trust, or at least point me in a direction that can be trusted.
And that's, I think, the role of the school leader, isn't it? To create a culture that's safe enough for somebody to ask those questions and say,
absolutely,
I understand why you're telling us to do this pedagogy or whatever it is, but can I add a different layer, or can I change that in this different way? Because that's hard as a graduate, isn't it? Trying to push against something where you go, it's just not feeling right, but I don't want to upset anyone, or they've told me this is the right one. And you do find that, when you work in schools, that it is, when you talk about the evidence, it is, oh, well, the school down the road's having great success with this program. And we're in the same catchment, so it must be the same. We're in a socioeconomic, so it must be the same, and we'll do that. And that's what we get caught in, that trap, don't we, of kind of maybe not doing that length of research that's required to work out what's best.
And I think it comes also, just very briefly, when we start to think about our pedagogical practices and our curriculum frameworks, one of the things that I found really interesting in some of the schools was that there was a disconnect between the number of learning theories and pedagogical practices that were actually incongruent with one another.
Yes.
And I'm not saying that they shouldn't be applied, but what it then, the problem for our teachers was that they were trying to implement both, and there was this cognitive disconnect to the point where they didn't know which one to lean into, and so either one was not being implemented with fidelity. And I think that's the other thing, is that we need to think about, well, what are the outcomes we're expecting? And maybe some of those conversations have not actually occurred because of that notion of, well, the school down the road is using it and it's working, so we'll just put it into ours. But meanwhile, we've got all of these other things. So we haven't actually taken anything off the table.
No. And when you even just talking before, we have this real focus on how our students learn. So this is the pedagogy, and this is what it is. And when you're talking there, and I'm sure you'll go to it, it's that I know for me, despite us doing these podcasts and stuff, podcasts for me, unless it's short and sweet, and I'm going to take those things, I find it quite auditory, quite difficult. And we talk about auditory processing for children. I similarly, if you give me a piece of paper to read, yes, I've got to keep re-highlighting, rewriting, and often making notes on that. So I know that sometimes that's if I've got the luxury time. But I'm great with a large sheet of A3 paper, scribbling, making notes, putting sticky notes on, drawing pictures. That's how I learn. So when you're going into some of those meetings, you've got that in your head as well. And
absolutely.
When we say they haven't taken it on board, well, because we only show them in one variant. I've stood at the front of the staff room and told you what to do. Surely that's enough.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because why have we then assumed that as adults that they don't need to represent their understanding in different forms or ways, or the time that it would take for them to, come back and have time to think about it and then respond, or even later when they've actually trialed it and something goes wrong. For me, it's always that I always look at the barometers around, if I've got people who are going, yes, fantastic. I go, great, that's wonderful. Let's see how that plays out. But I'm always more curious around my people who go, oh, for goodness sake, that's not going to work, Joanne. How will that ever work? And I go, you're right, let's have a look. And then gently look at, well, what might be here at play? What are the fundamental assumptions that I may not have recognized? Because I'm finding that, yes, I'm enthusiastic about this, but what have I not seen? So for me, having my prickly pears are fantastic. And from a social brain, and knowing again that if I say that's socially constructed, that's sociocultural, different perspectives, well, I want to look from those different, and it is uncomfortable. And it's going to take time, because you know what? It would be much faster if everybody just did what I asked them to do and we just get on with it.
Yep.
But I'm not sure that in fact is the best way to lead one curriculum renewal or lead learning.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
Now, I've taken up a lot of your time today, Anna.
No, I could go on all day. No, definitely. Because I'm.
Well, you can tell I could too.
Yeah, it's just so fascinating, because we look at curriculum from a very knowledge-based or content, as you say. That's what you need to know. And therefore, we've done our job as teachers that you come away and you can recite some of those curriculum. And we know the complexities between it, the hidden curriculum and all those sort of things. But our primary focus we often see is just to deliver that content and get the children to understand it. So and I think, and you briefly mentioned it before, we get a lot of external people who come in from other professions and tell us how to do something of, this is a project management, or this is, and great. Some of those skills are invaluable, especially in administrative roles. But I don't think we give ourselves enough credit as educators to know, actually, we can leave education and we can thrive in every environment, because we've already done analysis of our co-workers. We've been able to teach in 5 different ways. We've been able to compartmentalize and go for the loose stop, but also be on duty and do all this. We've got 100 things. And that's what I think is quite difficult when I find people coming into our thing, to understand that unless you've been in a classroom, like what you're saying, what your career is saying, unless you've been there and known the spinning plates are going, don't tell me how to suddenly stop and focus on one thing, because I can't. Like, this is what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I need a team, and I don't really need to know that person's a certain profile or that person's a different profile. I actually just need us all to come together and work forwards.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing, is that I always come back to, what are my beliefs about people?
Yes.
What are my beliefs about teaching, this thing we call teaching? And what are my beliefs about the way we learn? Now, I would go back to, is if I start from a premise that we learn differently, and because I'm interested in neuroscience, and I mean it in the fullest sense, not just about the organ of the brain, but I'm looking at this and saying, okay, what is uncontested is that we know that the architecture of the brain is different for everyone, and they're asymmetrical. So the hemispheres are asymmetrical. There's a reason for that, but what we don't do is we jump and we don't actually take the pieces. We shortcut because of the sound bites, and we don't always go back and check some of those key pieces. So if I'm saying that each brain is different, why would I then implement a program or a one-size-fits-all? And part of it is because of the convenience of the time that it takes. And that's where I find my disconnect, because that's where I go, okay, in which circumstances will these products or programs or the resources that I've accessed via wherever, will they support my learners, and which ones will they not? And how will I configure or be adaptable or flexible within the constraints? Because that's the other thing, is it's not that we don't have constraints. So it's how do I make all of these things work? And that is also about those juggling plates.
And that's it. I think this is the most important conversation we need to be having at this level, because we're seeing our own profession being hit by the media by a lot, but also those leaving it. And there's the kind of, the one says, oh, we'll just throw money at it, which we know doesn't work. And what we talk about, the biggest thing a lot of the time when we're in schools, we're talking about the engagement of students. But where are we giving the luxury of engagement of teachers? Because we're sort of making it a product where we don't want to talk about our job because it's just too complex and it's too hard. And we're kind of, oh, I've finished work, I don't do it. Whereas opposed to going like we're having, oh, this is really interesting, and I've got this kind of idea I want to try. So I don't think solutions that are being offered to us at the moment are the way forward.
You are absolutely correct. And in fact, I would suggest that they are taking us in a direction that is actually, one, deprofessionalising our profession, but also misunderstands and misrepresent what teaching is in schools. And the thing that is problematic is that when we think that, oh, it's because they need resources, we'll just keep throwing the packages at them. At the end of the day, I can, and I've seen this over and over again, where the resources have been provided and 5 different people have interpreted those resources because in different ways, because they were not given the time to have a conversation, or they did have the conversation, but it's on the run. And they're, or they're going from one to the other, or, so what is happening is that it's not that they haven't got the resources. They haven't had the time to interrogate it in relation to their context and the intended curriculum and their joint understanding of what does this mean? Are we on a similar page with regards to this?
And definitely. And I'm just in my head looking for scenarios that I've been in those situations where you go, and one thing I think of is we are role models to our students. But when we're not given that luxury of learning in the same context, it then becomes very difficult. So, you're talking about things like, and I'm thinking to myself, especially working in high trauma areas, consistency, being there every day, having the same message, all of us collectively being there so that if a child leaves my class and goes to another class, they know the expectation, they know what that person's thinking, that I've had a conversation with them to say, I've had a bad day, all that sort of thing. So we can do that with our students, but then sometimes we expect so much of our staff to go, okay, flip, we're going that way, change that, we're putting this new program in, do that. And so no wonder we lose their trust because we're expecting so much of them.
And I haven't even gone into the fact that at the start of a new year, we may have changed our teachers from year level to different, or they've come from different schools, or we've even got a new principal, deputy, and what happens is all of a sudden there's a whole additional layers, and we basically just do this. And I've heard different leaders say, walk in and they want to put their stamp on things or various. In our previous, we're going to use this because that worked, and what it does is it basically dishonors those that have been there and saying, well, what you've done is crap. Sorry, I shouldn't say that.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
You can beep that out. But what you've done is garbage, and, we're just going to come in and fix it. And I think that for me is just the most reprehensible way of working. But it's done. The thing is that people don't go in thinking that they have, they're trying to do their best. They want the best. But it's the way in which they're interacting that can send those messages that can be problematic long-term for building trust, for building that foundation of, those deeper conversations, those rigorous conversations where, you might have to look at some of the beliefs around what people see as learning, and you don't necessarily see it in the fast pace. It's in some of those curriculum conversations that all of a sudden a little gem and you think, I don't think that this person believes that their kids can learn, or they think that, the achievement standard has to be, they can't give an A until the end of the year. There's all of these little pieces that you don't necessarily come across until you have some of those conversations, or you're looking through those interactions and those artifacts that you go, I think something we might need to explore here.
Yeah, and you talked about the very beginning about curriculum reform and changes. We know people, as you just mentioned there, people come in and we often, I don't know, I feel there's a bit of hysteria when change happens. It's literally throw the bath out, get rid of it, but baby's going too, as opposed to going, especially I think when I worked at a car, like there's only a subtle change. A rewording does not constitute a whole new scheme of work that needs to go into place. And I think even all... even in each state and territory, they would all say the same. We're amending ACARA's version 9 to our context, to what it is. but that doesn't mean that you don't ground on what the excellent work you've done before. We're just asking you to slowly adapt new little additional elements, but you don't need to completely revise everything. And we see that, and I think in hysteria on social media, where someone will say, but is it aligned to the new curriculum or the old curriculum? That is where we've lost confidence in our staff. That's where they've lost their confidence.
And some of the people who are in those positions of leading that work, my concern is that they're misunderstanding, because I've heard, particularly with version 9, and having worked with it for a long time, I've heard, here in Queensland going, yes, there's major changes and there's more focusing on this, on that. And I'm like, okay, hold on a minute. I better go back and, and I've gone back and reread, and then I've reached out to who I would see as more expert than me, absolutely in those fields, and going, did I miss something? Somewhere along the line, did I miss something? And they're like, no. And, I go, okay, but why? And it becomes this other agenda that is operating. And that's where I get defensive for our poor teachers who are being pushed in ways where, had they got the time to actually ask questions rather than be shut down, that's the other part. It is problematic having people ask questions. But you see, wouldn't we want that? Because doesn't that show us that they're thinking and that they are engaged in? So for me, again, how do we have the protocols? What protocols have we got in place for those difficult or tricky conversations, rather than saying we're just not going to have them, let's shut them down?
Exactly. And it's a lovely conversation, I think, because I think that's where we do miss the social element of being able to explain our point of view. We've done a little series on oracy and the importance of oracy and being able to have your voice heard, especially for those children who don't have a voice. And coming to understand the point of view, and we get stuck in the blame game of it must be this person who's done it, which is why we're finding it difficult. And, we talk about that where people, I'm just thinking when we've got new curriculum reforms, it's not done because that person feels they're the expert, so therefore you're all going to do it on the amount of think tanks, the focus groups, all of that comes in from a national level is what causes the change. And it happens over a slow period of time. And so we have to sometimes get out of that mentality that it's someone else's fault that's not working, and spend that time, as you've just said, the whole way through, to spend that time working together and working what's right for your context, your school, your children, and importantly, your colleagues, isn't it?
Absolutely. And knowing that knowledge changes. So that's the other thing that I find really fascinating is this approach where we think knowledge is static, that, and truth, what does that mean? So for me, again, going, look, knowledge changes over time, because if we're learning new things, then how might we adjust our thinking? And I think that's probably something that we forget to do in the, again, those really tight timeframes in a school. Like, again, you and I have the luxury to be able to think on that and have these conversations with others. But how do we support our teaching teams and our schools and our leaders to do that work without them, basically doing a blame game and doing teacher bashing, or education bashing?
It is 100%. And I think that's what every one of us as an educator need to look inside of ourselves and say, what are we doing to support our profession to be the best we can be? And because that as a collective is the only way we're going to make those changes and see that drive and produce a workforce of the future that we're really proud of, isn't it? So I think it's up to the responsibility of us all.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me.
Thank you. It's been wonderful.